go. Okay, so please help me welcome to the stage the Honorable Alexander Mora, Minister of Foreign Trade of Costa Rica, the Honorable Masamichi Kono, Vice Minister for International Affairs at Japan's Financial Services Agency, Ambassador Michael Punk, the U.S. Ambassador to the WTO and our Deputy U.S. Trade Representative, Ambassador David O'Sullivan, the EU Ambassador to the United States, and our moderator, Ambassador Demetrios Marantis, Senior Vice President and Head of Global Government Relations at Visa. Thank you very much.
Good morning. How are you? Good to see you. Hi. Yes.
Oh, okay. Got double-sided sun. Oh.
Well, hi, everyone. Good morning. It's nice to see a lot of familiar faces out there. So this is where the Services Summit really gets global. And we're very fortunate here to have 4 outstanding senior officials from Costa Rica, Japan, the United States, and the EU with us here this morning to talk about the relationship between trade and services and sustainable economic growth. Their full bios are in your program, but let me give you a little bit of a snippet of each one of our panelists. Minister Alexander Mora is the Minister of Foreign Trade from Costa Rica. He oversees Costa Rica's foreign trade and investment portfolios, as well as Costa Rica's relationships with multilateral organizations like the WTO and the OECD. Minister Mora brings to public service over 25 years of experience as an entrepreneur in digital technology. And it will be particularly interesting to hear Minister Mora's perspective of how trade and services really has helped Costa Rica become the services exporter that it is today. We're also very fortunate today to have the Vice Minister for International Affairs from Japan's Financial Services Agency, Vice Minister Kono. Vice Minister Kono has an enormous amount of experience and expertise both in the area of financial regulation as well as trade and services. He represents the Japan Financial Services Agency internationally, and he oversees technical assistance activities and other outreach undertaken by the JFSA's newly created Asian Financial Partnership Center. He has extensive experience in financial regulation, and in the area of trade and services, he was secretary to the WTO's Financial Services Committee in the really seminal years of financial services negotiations between 1994 and 1999. We're also very pleased to have Ambassador Michael Punk, who many of you in here know very well. Ambassador Punk is a dear friend and a former colleague of mine. He has been USTR's lead negotiator, multilateral negotiator in the WTO, and is now also coordinating USTR's work on TTIP. Ambassador Punk has vast experience in Washington, as you all know. He worked at USTR previously. He worked in the White House. He worked in the Senate for, we share another common boss, Max Baucus, who's now the ambassador to China. And many of you also know that Ambassador Punk is an extraordinarily accomplished author, has written several books of fiction and nonfiction, including my favorite, Fire and Brimstone, as well as The Revenant. And then next to me, we are lucky to have Ambassador David O'Sullivan, another very familiar face to many of you in the audience. Ambassador O'Sullivan assumed his current post in November 2014, and he has been so intimately involved in the world of international trade, having served as the EU's Commission's Director General for Trade, as Secretary General for the Commission. I first met Ambassador O'Sullivan several years ago, or many years ago, I guess it is now, when he was the head of cabinet for Commission President Romano Prodi. So we have a great panel today, and you're not here to listen to me, you're here to listen to them. So why don't we start by launching the first question for all the panelists. in terms of the area of services and its connection to sustainable development. One of the big initiatives in the world of services today is the Trade and Services Agreement, the TISA negotiations. The 14th round of negotiations concluded earlier this month, and now that the TPP negotiations have been completed, many expect TISA to gain additional momentum. And I would love just to get the panel's perspective on TISA, your view of its role, your view of whether or not the recent conclusion of TPP will inject new momentum into the negotiations. Minister Mora, why don't we start with you?
Yes, thank you, Dimitri, for the opportunity and for the invitation. And good morning to all of you. Costa Rica, being a small economy in all senses, has been part of TISA since the early stages of it. And we recognize that TISA is a proactive way to advance in the global agenda of on trade and services, an agenda that definitely must be a priority these days. In our case, this is a priority for several reasons, but probably the most important one is the fact that for our country, small in scale, to be part of global value chains, services is one of the hubs. And it is extremely important for us to see progress in that area, because it's a way for us to move our economy more into the global economy. During the last 20 years, in fact, Costa Rica has been an active member in the multilateral system. And we already have in place 12 free trade agreements. In those free trade agreements, in 11 of them, in fact, there are provisions on trade and services. Probably the most ambitious one is being CAFTA, an agreement that triggered Costa Rica to the regulation of the telecommunications sector and the insurance sector, and has been giving us the chance to move very, very fast to leverage many of the disadvantages that we had in the digital sector, in particular in the telecommunications sector in the past. We see TISA as a clear opportunity to discuss a modern and updated framework for trade and services, which can be multilateralized in the future, and I hope in the near future. It is important to mention also that TISA has a number of new disciplines to the WTO, and some of these disciplines are probably completely unknown in the organization. So this is one of the complexities that TISA has, and it's one of the reasons why the countries that are now part of TISA, in my view, are doing a very strong contribution to the system. Just to finish, there is one other comment that I want to make, and it's related to the perception of transparency in the process. I think that the countries involved in this process should revise the procedures and the way they're chairing and they're including other stakeholders into the discussion, because I don't think it's a good environment for the negotiation. This perception of lack of transparency. But other than that, I hope this will come true, and this process will end in a positive way, to modernize the system and to give a new perspective of something, services, which is new, but extremely important for the development, especially for developing countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Mora. Vice Minister Kono, what are your thoughts?
Yes, thank you. Great pleasure and honor to be here. Well, my day job is financial regulation and supervision. So I should say I spend maybe 99% of my daytime worrying about global financial regulatory reform, particularly post-crisis after we had this terrible global financial crisis. But then, believe it or not, we also worry about trade liberalization in financial services overnight, and my night is your day. So there is some continuity there. Well, first of all, as a government, of course, the Japanese government is quite eager and quite delighted to be part of the TISA negotiations. We, as a financial regulator, also are definitely involved in the negotiations. But then we are also, of course, taking part in actually a very large number of negotiations of EPAs, FTAs, both bilaterally and plurilaterally, if there's such a word. And of course, we were delighted to see the TPP finally agreed in Atlanta. Let's say in this complex world and a globalized financial world, we will certainly be quite interested in having a good agreement under TISA. And we will be interested if, and of course in our hope that some important objectives are achieved. One being that, of course, TISA is as broad as possible and as inclusive as possible in terms of scope and coverage, and in the number of nationalities or jurisdictions involved. We would like to certainly have it as broad and wide encompassing as possible. Second, we would like this to be, of course, consistent with the other agreements that we have been either agreeing upon or have already concluded, ratified. And particularly with the GATS agreement, of course, we would like consistency. Otherwise, of course, we will end up in a very complex legal framework that is in the interest of no one. Final point is, I think we do need some momentum, and so maybe this is an opportunity for TISA to move forward. Having had an agreement on TPP, certainly we can focus more on TISA. And of course, as a financial regulator, again, we will be mindful of this as we go along. I have a few words to mention on the regulatory work that we've been undertaking, not in the context of those trade agreements, but in the G20 and other Financial Stability Board agenda, but maybe I'll leave that for later.
Okay, thank you. Ambassador Punk.
Thanks, Demetrios, and good morning, everybody. Just to offer our perspective very briefly on how TISA fits into the scheme of things now and how we see it moving forward, I think it's useful to recall, first of all, sort of where TISA came from. And if you look back historically, at the end of the Uruguay round in 1994, you had two areas, agriculture and services, which members felt had not been dealt with sufficiently and therefore were made part of the so-called built-in agenda for the WTO's work. And so when Doha was launched in 2001, there was a big expectation that multilaterally we would be able to grapple with some of these services issues that had not been successfully dealt with in the context of the Uruguay round. Unfortunately, if you fast forward the clock a decade from 2001 to 2011, we still found ourselves in a position of not seeing potential for the fully multilateral negotiations to move the services issues forward in this sector that is obviously so important to the U.S. economy and to the economies of many WTO members. And we really spent the entire year of 2011, and I remember this very well, exploring with our WTO counterparts whether there was some way to use this fully multilateral configuration to make progress in the services area. And unfortunately, the conclusion that we came to was that we were not going to make progress there. And it was out of that frustration that we decided to launch the TISA initiative. And it was initially co-chaired by the US and Australia. The European Union has come on as a third co-chair in the process. And where we're at today, I think, is in what most of the participants view as one of the more vibrant and interesting negotiations taking place anywhere in the world, and certainly in Geneva. We started with 15 participants. We now have, I believe, 24. We are engaged in what is now a completely text-driven negotiation with texts across a broad range of disciplines of very significant importance to companies, including many of those that are in this room today. We have market access on the table from every participant with the exception of one. And in many cases, not all, but in many cases, those market access offers reflect the best market access that participants have given to anyone, anywhere in their existing free trade arrangements. So there's a lot that is very good there and a lot that makes us very excited about TISA. I do think, and this is the question of where is TISA going, that there is a desire on the part of all the participants to move it forward more rapidly. We invented this negotiation out of whole cloth, and we've tried to be very nimble as we've gone along in learning by doing. And all of us want the negotiation to move more quickly. The US hosted the most recent round in Geneva, which was just last week. And part of the conversation was, how can we take this thing that is good and make it work more quickly and get to the finish line more quickly? I think everyone agrees on a goal, not a deadline, but a goal of trying to finish this thing in 2016. And we talked last week about ways that we can make the thing move faster, and I'm happy to get into a lot more details about that. But the bottom line is that I think we remain extremely bullish on TISA as a place for doing something meaningful in expanding trade opportunities in the area of services.
Thanks. Ambassador O'Sullivan?
Well, thank you very much, Demetrios. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm assured that there are people I know in the audience, but frankly, with these lights in my eyes, I can't see anyone. So hello to the people who know me and hello to those that don't. I am, as Demetrios said, a recovering trade negotiator, so I'm the sort of odd one out on this panel because now I'm just an ambassador. And as you know, diplomacy is the ability to speak intelligently on any subject for 5 minutes, which is just about the time I think I've been given, so I should just about make it through. But what I wanted to say was that from my trade days, I always found the world of services negotiation a very special world. And people who negotiate, the experts on services, are a very strange breed of people. I mean, no criticism, they're wonderful, but sometimes I would struggle to actually understand what was the point of it all, because I would say to them, well, what does this change in the real world? I mean, what actually will be different for an economic operator if we do this or we don't? And that was all, yeah, but that's not really the point. The point is, you see, we've bound things in this agreement and we've bound things in that. I'm saying, yes, but is there actually something new here, or are we simply recycling what we've already been doing? And it's a mixture of both is the answer. But I think the challenge, the technology of services negotiations is quite complex. I mean, actually trying to evaluate what you're really putting on the table and what you're really getting out of it. And this, I think, has been part of the problem. I mean, I remember well the services negotiation, and I think Peter Algar is out there when he was ambassador in Geneva. And I sometimes used to reproach the US, say they weren't taking seriously enough the services side of the Doha negotiations because we felt we were trying to push a rock up the mountain. But I mean, it was also because it was sometimes difficult to figure out what you were actually trying to achieve in terms of concrete outcomes. And there's a very interesting study which the OECD have just brought out using a concept I'm familiar with in tariffs but have never heard applied to services, the notion of water, the difference between what you've actually liberalized and your sort of theoretical margin of maneuver. And I must admit, I haven't read the survey, but I'll be very interested to look at it, because I think it does try to give a picture of what is the real economic value that's still there to be squeezed out of further liberalization. Now, I think most of the people on this panel are actually come from parts of the world that have already done a lot and are probably amongst the most open, which is not to say that we can't do more, and I think we should, because the importance of services, the contrast which has always struck me is the huge importance which services plays in our economies, and we're all agreed that it's so much more important than the sort of traditional manufacturing and other areas. And yet the challenge of grappling with real new market opening techniques, because to be frank, the situation, it seems to me, is we're often at a point where some of the stuff is now highly sensitive for us all domestically. And we all have, subjects which we know are particularly difficult for us. And so the question is, how can you actually persuade your domestic constituencies to move further in those difficult areas? And this, I think, is the challenge of service negotiations. And Minister Mora mentioned, the whole issue of transparency, because the minute you talk now about services, you are also into, at least in the minds of many of our populations, the issue of public services, the ability of governments to sort of control the environment and the extent to which you're going to lose control over it. So I think this is something which does make the thing more complicated. Having said that, I agree with everything that's been said. TISA is a very important effort to drive forward this services agenda. Initially, if you like, amongst a coalition of the willing. We have some issues that we think would merit particular attention. I could talk about telecoms or the issue of government procurement, for example, where we've made a proposal. But this is not the moment here to sort of trade negotiating positions. I've always understood that it is an attempt to get a high level of ambition and then encourage others to join. I think there is a discussion to be had about the sequencing of that. The minister also mentioned, we are quite open to bringing in other participants, because we do think ultimately the idea is to make sure that the best practice, which I think people on this platform can aspire to or lay claim to, would actually be spread more widely, because I think that's where perhaps some of the greatest economic gains for us are to be found, rather than necessarily between us. And I think that's going to be one of the challenges. But I fully take what Ambassador Punka said, that we have this process. We need now to take it forward. Michael, I get a shiver down my spine when I hear people mentioning a date, because the windows of opportunity I saw come and go in the DDA. I've lost 5 years of my life to about 7 windows of opportunity, but I think it is helpful to have a sort of indicative deadline in which you try to make progress. Clearly, what we want this to be is to be a sort of, I hate to use the word, but a kind of gold standard of what we can do in the services area, and then encourage other people to come in. Maybe it might be useful to have some of those people already at the table, but that's a discussion we'll have to continue. So I think this is an important initiative, certainly for the European Union. We're fully seized of the importance of services in our economy, in the global economy. It is very much the future, particularly for people at the upper end of the economic model, where you're talking about high value added. And I think this is a hugely important discussion, and I hope that TPP can give it momentum. I hope that TTIP can give it momentum, and all the other trade negotiations that we're conducting. We're also negotiating with Japan. So I hope that we can get, the more deals can now be concluded in the coming period, the more momentum we get behind the general principle of liberalization, and then hopefully maybe get back to Geneva and somehow multilateralize as much of this as we can. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, David. Well, thanks to the panelists for those insights on TISA. Let's now try to explore some of these issues in a little bit more depth. And let me start with Minister Mora, who, in your career, you've played a real leadership role in attracting foreign investment in Costa Rica's services sector, helping to build it into the regional hub that it is. I gather now that services accounts for a larger share of Costa Rica's exports than does agriculture. I'd be curious if you could give us a bit more sense as to what was your strategy, what was Costa Rica's strategy for attracting foreign investment in services, and what policy changes Costa Rica needed to implement at the national level in order to do so.
Well, thank you for the question and the opportunity to address the audience, giving some specific perspective of how the country and what we're doing in the country to to accelerate our growth and development. First, there are certain factors that the country has been able to build up along the time in doing some, in many cases, some very pioneer decisions. Of course, abolishing the army back in 1948 was a clever decision because the country was able to reallocate a lot of resources to some of the substantive areas that now are key for our positioning and development. The geographic location, of course, is a great advantage in the heart of the Western Hemisphere. Political stability, social stability, the infrastructure that the country has developed, the very open economy that the country has created in the last 20, 25 years after going into the first in a period with unilateral incorporation to the global economy and reduction of tariffs, and then into the bilateral and plurilateral negotiations. And this set of factors are great foundations for the country to be in a good position to present itself as a society and as a modern country with a high prosperity environment. And from my view, this is key to services, because in services, all these factors are really the important factors. Back in the early 80s, Costa Rica's economy was relying on three main products of exports: coffee, banana, and meat, basically. And back in 3 years back, we just went in a completely different perspective, where most of our exports are coming from the electronic components sector, from the medical equipment and precision equipments, and services. And as you mentioned, agriculture is still an important part of our economy, but compared to all these new sectors, it's a part of the economy that has been growing in absolute terms, but in relative terms has been dropping to less than 10% of the GDP. Now, services. When you look at services in Costa Rica, our economy is now about 72% of GDP in services, which is literally in the same levels of the developed countries. 69% of the employment in the country comes from the services sector, so it's a huge piece of the economy. Services exports have been growing almost 10% a year in the last 10 years. And for last year, services exports account for 36% of the total exports of the country. And by this year, we expect to pass the 40%. So this is very important for us, because the way we are moving ahead is by a partnership between multinational firms and local firms. This is important to mention that a significant piece of this new economy, or services economy in Costa Rica, is coming from external investments. And even when you see the composition of the foreign direct investment coming into Costa Rica, now 35% of the new investments are coming from the services sector. So it's a very fast-moving sector, very dynamic. It's giving us a lot of new elements that the economy needs. And our participation in the global value chains is very well defined through the services sector, because in the main 5 or 6 value global chains where Costa Rica has a prominent participation, services is an important piece of that. Now, regarding to public policy, I think that I will focus on 3 main elements. The first one is, of course, education. Education it's key for any country that wants to move ahead in the services economy. Of course, you cannot move too quickly in education. This is something that has a gradual evolution. Costa Rica started investing in education 150 years back, declaring the primary education compulsory and paid by the government. Just 3 years back, we increased the constitutional mandate to allocate 8% of GDP to public education. Last year, we were able to achieve 7.2%. And by the end of Solis administration, we hope to be in the 8% of GDP to education, public education. That is very important because the discussion, it's a little different to the discussion they used to have in the past. It's a discussion more about quality than about quantity. We are, of course, setting up a different type of approach how to deal with the quality in education. Well, this has to do with public-private partnership, how we involve private companies to help us in government to improve educational services across the country, identifying new areas in which the industry will need talent in the future. And by doing that, we are putting a new dynamic into the educational sector. Some areas in which we have been particularly successful, I guess, are digital technologies. We are doing a very strong national effort in terms of languages. If you see what some multinational companies are doing in Costa Rica, they are providing services in 10 different languages, virtually to the 5 continents. And we are also very, very involved in the idea of productive linkages, how we link local SMEs with multinational companies, for multinational companies to grow roots in Costa Rica, and also for small companies to go global. And I think that this is something that I particularly have been involved in deep, and there is a lot of potential for the country to move away and to move up in that direction. With respect to innovation, this is a key factor. We have some very, very important areas in which we need to focus. One of them is finance. How do we put enough fresh financial capital to the services sector in a financial sector that still works in the way of no land, no loan? It's a major challenge for the country. And I think that there is a very important part of the attention that the government and my colleagues in the Ministry of Science, Technology and Telecommunication and the Ministry of Education are doing. We have a very strong public system, a public university system, which is has been doing most of the investments in innovation. But this new innovation ecosystem and all the internet economy and the services economy that the country is developing are changing the whole picture, because what the private sector is doing in terms of innovation is a fundamental transformation for the future of the country. Some of you might probably hear about Intel moving away from Costa Rica the manufacturing of microprocessors that happened last year. But at the same time, Intel decided to bring to Costa Rica the Mega Lab, which is a very massive facility to do testing of prototypes and very focused on innovative areas. We're working with Intel to leverage the human talent because it's very clear that we don't have enough people to this new type of activities. Other companies in the IT sector, in the medical devices, are coming to Costa Rica to do research and development. And so it's very clear that there we have to focus and do a better job with the support of the companies. And the final component of this strategy is the open economy. We ambition to continue to grow our market access through the world. As I mentioned, most of our free trade agreements already include some provisions regarding services sector, but we think there is still space to grow and to go in depth. In some of the negotiations we will be going through to improve those free trade agreements, we are putting on the table to our trade partners the services sectors as an ambition to go further. And I think that all these multilateral efforts with TISA, for example, are it's a process in which Costa Rica has to be very active because this is an important pillar of the strategy that we have in place to assure that the conditions for this services economy will continue to be the part of the incentives that the country provide to the investors and to the local companies to grow. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Mora. Vice Minister Kono, your career has really sat at the intersection of financial regulation, financial services, and the promotion of sustainable